Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Neal Gabler, the author of Against the Wind, Edward Kennedy and the Rise of Conservatism, 1976 to 2009. This is volume 2 of his Ted Kennedy biography. And you might remember we had him on our show back in early 2021 to discuss volume 1. So welcome back. You've completed the series, and now we're completing our series with you. Good to have you back.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. We last left our hero in 1975, just as the political winds began to shift in this country. Your first volume is titled Catching the Wind as opposed to Against the Wind, because you argue that Ted Kennedy benefited from the prevailing feeling during the first half of his career that America ought to protect the New Deal and even expand it for things like Medicare and equal justice under the law. Ted Kennedy, at that point, had been in the Senate 13 years and had seen both of his brothers killed. He'd played a role in several critical pieces of legislation and had been the focal point of a national scandal. So, Neal, have you been able to identify when Ted Kennedy first realized that the mood of the nation was shifting against his own ideology?
Well, volume 1 ends, I think, with a kind of signal moment in Ted Kennedy's political education. It ends with the Boston anti-busing riots in late 1974 and then again in the spring of 1975. And Ted Kennedy, who'd been an advocate of busing for integration, although not the most vocal advocate, I should add, became a target of the very ethnic groups, the white Irish and Italians, who had supported him through most of his career. But when Ted Kennedy advocated for integrated schools and for busing to effectuate that, he literally ran for his life. And the book, volume 1, ends with him running for his life, attending a anti-busing rally on the plaza at Boston, where he thought he might be able to soothe the savage beast of those anti-busing protesters. And in fact, he not only failed to soothe them, but again, they chased him off that plaza and into, ironically, the John F. Kennedy Federal Building. In April of 1975, he was giving a speech in Quincy, Massachusetts, at a high school that had nothing whatsoever to do with busing, but he had been hounded by this group of angry, anti-busing protesters, and they got wind of where he was, and they surrounded the high school. And when I say literally ran for his life, when he exited, they had already put dog excrement on the handles of his car. And now they began chasing him, and he ran down into the T station, the subway station. His staff sort of barricaded the station as this angry crowd, which had been pelting him and actually hitting him, physically assaulting him. He ran down into that, happened to catch an incoming train, jumped on that train and got out. But those episodes, I think, so dramatically illustrated that the very people who had been his supporters and his advocates, and who had been the very heart of the New Deal, and then later of the New Frontier, his brother's campaign, and of the Great Society, now had turned. They had turned, and Kennedy realized that. And it was one of the reasons I believe, and I say this in the book, that I think he did not run for the presidency in 1976, when he probably had the best chance of his life of capturing the nomination and the presidency.
How did he reflect on that change in his own constituents?
Well, reflected on it that the country was changing. And he wasn't particularly happy about it. But he realized that the apex of liberalism, the whole notion of catching the wind that I discuss in volume 1, and which I refer to as sort of a moral crease. And I use that word moral crease because there was this period in American history in after John F. Kennedy's death, and I attribute it to some extent to John F. Kennedy's death and the sense of redemption that the country felt it needed. It, in some ways, it had to pay for Kennedy's death. And in fact, Lyndon Johnson said that when he became president. He said privately, "We've got to use this death," by which he meant we've got to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We've got to pass the Voting Rights Act eventually of 1965. We've got to pass Medicare. These initiatives that John F. Kennedy started, we have to repay what happened to John Kennedy by passing these things. But that wind had shifted, and Kennedy fully realized it. And in point of fact, Evan, he spent the rest of his life, trying to keep the flame of liberalism alive, even as it was flickering in that countervailing wind. I mean, so much of his career is devoted to this very thing.
I do have to say the books that you've written here are astonishingly good, and there are a couple thousand. No, there are a couple thousand pages, and it's an astonishing achievement, and they're beautifully written. And
Thank you so very much.
I will say I haven't gotten through all of them yet, but they will be gotten through because I love long biographies, and I have a couple of questions about that later. But
well, I will say this, Evan. Today long books are very much out of fashion. This is a TikTok, Twitter society, and I've paid a certain price for writing what amount to just under 2,000 pages when you take the totality, 2,000 pages of text. But let me defend the long book and the serious book. This is the biggest story, in my estimation, of our political lifetimes. Not the story of Ted Kennedy, but the story of what happened to liberalism and how it was eclipsed by conservatism. This is the biggest story of our lifetimes, and it leads to our doorstep. I mean, your podcast is about, how history reverberates in the present. Well, this story that I'm telling, the story of the rise of conservatism and the eclipse of liberalism, reverberates to this very moment in the presidency of Donald Trump and what we can foresee in the future. So that's why it's a long book. They're both long books because the story is so big.
It's big, and it's really good, and it's really well told. And I appreciate the long sentences. I really do. And I know that, as you put it, they're out of fashion, but as a Carol fan myself, I was like, boy, this is like the closest echo I've read of Robert Caro, maybe ever.
Well, that's the highest compliment I could be paid. So
there you go.
And people have been saying that about the book. So I have to say, I feel incredibly gratified that to be compared to Robert Caro.
Well, there you go. And I don't do that lightly, I'll tell you that. How should we sum up, just so we know who we're talking about here, how should we sum up volume 1? Give me your 900 pages and sum it up in a few minutes here, just so we know who we're dealing with as we delve into this episode. Teddy Kennedy is sort of, as you put it, the least of the Kennedy brothers. He grew up in the shadow of his brothers' careers. He came up at a different time, he was not forged during World War II the way his older brothers were. But he does wind up in the Senate anyway. What do we need to know about who this man is as we delve into the second half of his career, as he goes from with the wind to against the wind?
Yes, what we need to know is that he caught the wind of his brothers, John and Robert, and of Lyndon Johnson for that matter, although there was great antipathy between Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. He caught that wind, and when his brothers died, he inherited the mantle. He gives a very famous speech, at least in his career, in Worcester, Massachusetts, after Robert Kennedy's death, when he comes out of seclusion. And he says, I pick up the fallen standard of my brothers. And so volume one is very much about Ted Kennedy, riding that liberal wind, and not only riding it, but also helping to provide the gusts for it as he picks up that fallen standard and becomes, I think, inarguably the most significant liberal in America, post, Robert Kennedy. He becomes the guy I mentioned earlier, that he keeps the flame flickering a bit as it almost gets extinguished. But that whole volume is about the things that he does in the face of the Nixon presidency. It's a very important episode in American history to understand, because the changes in American political culture really begin with the Nixon presidency. And the last part of volume one is how Ted Kennedy, in effect, becomes a shadow president, as I call him, fighting Richard Nixon's desire to destroy the New Deal, to destroy liberalism, to create what Richard Nixon views as a permanent Republican majority, a permanent conservative majority. And one of my favorite lines in that book, and which in some way summarizes, I use it as a chapter heading, the whole enterprise of Nixon, is when he's talking to one of his cronies, and he says about liberalism and how he's going to destroy it: people don't want to be improved. That's Nixon's cynical view, that people don't want to be improved, and liberals are always playing to the best of people, and people don't want to be improved. And that in some way summarizes volume one, because, again, as I said earlier, it ends on that sort of pinion of the rise of liberalism, and now there is the fear, the backlash against the civil rights movement, the backlash against government activism. A whole lot of backlash is going on there. And Ted Kennedy is basically the casualty of that, as is liberalism itself.
The casualty of liberalism is often pinned at the feet of Ronald Reagan and the revolution that starts to come in 1980. And of course, Ted Kennedy ran for the presidency in 1980. And that race between him and between the sitting president is often blamed for the shattering of the Democratic Party that allowed such a wide open door for Ronald Reagan to walk through it and bring conservatism along with him. How do you view that contention, and how did that battle between Teddy and Jimmy play out?
Well, I think that the contention that Ted Kennedy, by running against Jimmy Carter, somehow damaged, even fatally, liberalism, I think is somewhat absurd and is not borne out by the facts. For one thing, I mean, just to jump to the conclusion before I talk about the Kennedy-Carter contest, Ronald Reagan was not a popular candidate for the presidency in 1980, riding this great wave of conservatism. Until Hillary Clinton ran against Donald Trump, I don't think there were two more despised candidates for the presidency than Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. They were both detested. And what people forget is that in the final weekend of that election, Jimmy Carter held, among likely voters, according to the Gallup poll, I think an 8-point lead. And Ronald Reagan won by 10 points 3 days later. And the only thing that people can say, and that one can surmise, is not that Reagan was such a popular candidate going into this, but that Jimmy Carter was a very unpopular figure, and people decided that the lesser of two evils was Ronald Reagan, because they didn't know what he was going to do, and they did know what Jimmy Carter was going to do. But now let's get back to the contest of Ted Kennedy against Jimmy Carter. Ted Kennedy ran against Jimmy Carter not because, as Carter believed, he was an opportunist. Ted Kennedy was opportunistic, but in this case, he was not driven by opportunism. He ran against Jimmy Carter because he felt that Jimmy Carter was insufficiently liberal, and that liberalism and the Democratic Party needed an advocate, because there were the Ronald Reagans on the horizon, because conservatism was a threat to what Kennedy saw as the moral underpinnings of liberalism. It's compassion, it's decency, it's tolerance, whatever. That's how Kennedy viewed it. I mean, obviously, if you're conservative, you view it very differently. And Kennedy took on Jimmy Carter because Jimmy Carter had embraced austerity as president of the United States. His idea was, what people want now is what people fear now is, higher taxation, a greater deficit. We can't put money into government programs. We won't succeed that way. The American people don't want it. Ted Kennedy felt quite the opposite. The flashpoint was national health care. Ted Kennedy's primary goal in his entire political career to provide health insurance, to have the government provide health insurance for individuals who could not pay for health insurance themselves. Jimmy Carter was a very reluctant advocate for national health care. And the two of them just came to a clash on these things, with Jimmy Carter insisting that eventually he would propose a healthcare plan, but it would be phased in. And Ted Kennedy, who understood the Senate far better than Jimmy Carter did, said, once you phase in something, it will never
phase it out. Yeah, you don't phase them out, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
It's not going to be phased in. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
It's just not the way it works. And that was why Kennedy, I mean, there were two reasons why Kennedy took on Jimmy Carter. I mean, the overarching reason was liberalism, I said earlier. But the two flashpoints were, one, national health care, and the second was the speech. It's sort of summarized by the speech that Carter gave in July of '79. It's known as the Malaise speech, although we all know he never used the word malaise, where Carter comes to the American people and he says, we're failing. But he says the American people are failing, not just him. We're all failing. And Ted Kennedy watched that speech. I have this scene in the book. And he said, what the hell? Can you imagine my brothers ever addressing the American people by saying, you're a bunch of failures? This is not how you lead the nation. You raise the spirits of the nation. You call the nation. You summon them. That's what you do. And when Ted Kennedy saw that, I mean, it was almost ordained at that moment that he was going to run for the presidency to raise the spirits of the American people and to save liberalism, which was his main mission throughout his life.
You mispronounced healthcare, by the way. It's healthcare.
You're right.
Kea. How much you write that Teddy had a couple of realizations over the course of, I guess, that 10 years or so, that he may not ever be president. And then he has to sort of settle in to his role and his job as a senator. How much did it hurt him that he would never be president? But also, how did that help free him to take on what would become his life's work as a legislator?
That's a great question. I mean, I think he wanted to be president of the United States. There was some contention about this matter. Did he really want to be president? I think it was Arthur Schlesinger Jr. who said, and I quote this in the first volume, that John and Robert had executive temperaments and that Teddy had a parliamentary temperament, by which he meant he wasn't suited to be president of the United States. He was suited to be a senator. And one could, I think, make that argument that having grown up in a family where he was the youngest and considered the least, you said earlier, overshadowed by his brothers, which is very much the way he felt, he learned within his family how to deal with being the least. And that was a kind of legislative temperament. How do you work within a family where nobody particularly respects you, where everybody looks at you as sort of the comic relief? Well, that was great training for going to the Senate, where he was also considered the least. But he, in a way that his brothers did not, he respected the institution of the Senate. John and Robert couldn't wait to get out of the Senate. It was unmistakable that for John and Robert, the Senate was a stepping stone.
Yeah, what am I doing here?
Yeah. I mean, there's a scene I have in the book where in volume 1, where Robert and Ted are attending a Senate hearing together, and Robert leans over to Ted and he says, "How can you stand this?" I mean, they couldn't wait to get out of it. I mean, John Kennedy barely attended
Right.
hearings. I mean, it was like, okay, I've done this. Now the presidency.
Right.
But Ted was not like that. I mean,
Right.
Ted couldn't afford to be like that, for one thing. He knew he had to work hard. He knew he had to be deferential. He knew he had to win the respect of his fellow senators because he wasn't heading to the presidency immediately. He was only 30 years old when he entered the Senate. So, he understood the Senate in a way that his brothers chose not to understand the Senate. And I have a chapter early in volume 2 that I call The Chemistry of the Senate, where I describe how Ted Kennedy learned, very much like Lyndon Johnson learned, to work the Senate, to make the Senate work for him. They did it in very different ways. Lyndon Johnson's was the hard power of intimidation and fear, and Ted Kennedy's was the soft power of congeniality and sociability. But both men understood the institution and how to work that institution. And Ted Kennedy was determined that he was going to be a great senator and he was going to use the Senate.
As we go into the 80s and Ted begins to observe Ronald Reagan and conservatism and this rise of this new power in America, how did he interact with Reagan? What did he think of Ronald Reagan? And
Yeah,
what
that's
was
an interesting thing. Ted Kennedy had no love for Richard Nixon and despised him, frankly, and had very little love for Jimmy Carter, as we just said. I don't think that you could find two temperaments that were more dissimilar than Jimmy Carter's, which was cold and sanctimonious and self-righteous, and Ted Kennedy's, who was gregarious and warm and always self-deprecatory. I mean, these were two very different personalities.
and
But
definitely not sanctimonious, right?
pardon?
And definitely not
No,
sanctimonious.
oh no, he
Right?
was never. He was not. He couldn't afford to be sanctimonious, given his personal life. But Ronald Reagan and Ted Kennedy, despite the great dissimilarity politically, were in many ways similar in temperament. Reagan was gregarious. Reagan was sociable. Reagan was warm. Kennedy knew very little about Ronald Reagan before Reagan entered the presidency. They had had almost no contact. They'd never met one another prior to Reagan's presidency. But I love this scene where he meets Reagan early in the presidency, and he comes back to his friend John Culver, who was his Harvard roommate and now a senator from Iowa. And Culver says, "Well, what's your reading on this guy? What do you think of him?" And Ted says, "Well, I'll tell you this. If I had any doubts about me being able to be president of the United States, they've been allayed. If this guy
Those
can be
doubts are
president,
gone.
anybody can be president." But on a personal basis, Reagan did all the things that Jimmy Carter did not do. I mean, he extended his hand to Ted Kennedy. He gave Robert Kennedy posthumously the gold medal. He actually attended a fundraiser for the John F. Kennedy Library as president at Ted Kennedy's home. So, Reagan understood the Kennedy method, which is that's how you get people to cooperate. Now, let's look at the political side of this. Politically, Ted Kennedy felt that he was in a wasteland. He knew that Reagan had acquired popularity in the course of his presidency, not in his first 2 years. We forget this. We talk about our inflation and potential recession now. People forget that in Reagan's first 2 years, I mean, we not only had gigantic inflation, double-digit inflation, but we had double-digit unemployment. I mean, Reagan's first couple of years of the presidency were disastrous, but eventually he gained enough, power and enough popularity that Ted Kennedy understood he was not only sailing against the wind, but to use another analogy, he was banging his head against a wall. And the way that Ted Kennedy operated, I think this is really interesting, Evan. It's one of the most interesting things in understanding how Kennedy operated and how liberalism operated generally. He thought, there's nothing I can do about this guy. It's just, liberalism has no traction against this kind of man, except for one thing. Except for one thing. Ronald Reagan had a moral hole. He wasn't a deeply moral man. In fact, I think the Reagan presidency is probably best summarized by a line of Mario Cuomo's, in which he said, Ronald Reagan's great achievement was in making the denial of compassion respectable. Ted Kennedy understood that. And he still believed that the American people subscribed to compassion. And so if you look at the things that Ted Kennedy did during the Reagan presidency, they're almost always those campaigns to move through that moral hole that Ronald Reagan had. Most significantly, probably, the South African sanctions. Ronald Reagan was adamantly opposed to sanctions against South Africa. And Ted Kennedy was just as equally, forceful in advocating for them and in working for them, and ultimately getting enough Republicans to override Reagan's veto of South African sanctions. So it became a moral battle. And I'll tell you why I think this is important, Evan. And I'll tell you why I think that this is in some ways a real fulcrum in American politics. You alluded earlier, you talked about the Reagan Revolution. And people think about the Reagan Revolution as a realignment of the political factions, that the white working class abandoned the Democratic Party, went eventually to Reagan. Actually, that started earlier with Richard Nixon. They were Nixon Democrats before there were Reagan Democrats. And the conservatism began to take hold. But the story I tell in this volume is a somewhat different story. What Ronald Reagan did, apropos of that line of Mario Cuomo's, is that he morally recalibrated the nation. This was a nation that subscribed to, if you want to call it liberal morality, I don't think it's liberal morality necessarily. It's sort of golden rule morality. It's the morality we're all taught when we're growing up. It's the morality of compassion and tolerance and decency. This is what our parents tell us. Whether they're conservative or liberal, most of them tell us, this is how you ought to behave. You treat others with kindness. You love your neighbor. You're compassionate for those in need. And this became the very basis of liberalism. And Reagan changed it all. Reagan said it's not about compassion. It's about hard work and self-sufficiency and obedience. And one could run down that list. But he said, this is what morality really is. And what Ronald Reagan did is he changed American morality. And that became the basis of conservatism. And that's the battle that Ted Kennedy and other liberals had to wage in this country and have been waging now for the last 50 years. A battle to recover that morality of what one might call golden rule morality, liberal morality, the morality of compassion, to recover that.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray-baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
How important is it for us to explore the ins and outs of Ted Kennedy's very tumultuous personal life as he goes through this time period? He gets divorced. There are a number of scandals that hit the papers. There are some quite compromising, you could say, photographs that are printed. How important is that part of the story into the larger theme here of Ted Kennedy going against the wind?
It's important because it fits into that larger theme. Chappaquiddick which is I deal
in
with
volume
in
one.
volume
Yeah.
one. Yeah. Chappaquiddick's important, not because it denies Kennedy the presidency or an opportunity to challenge Richard Nixon in 72. I don't think he would have challenged him. I don't think he would have won. But it's important because it's the first time that we get this conflation of public and personal morality in political life. Before that, one's private life was pretty much, off limits to the press. And because it was off limits to the press, it was off limits to the public. But Richard Nixon works tirelessly. I mean, he sends private detectives down at government expense to trail Ted Kennedy everywhere that Ted Kennedy goes, because he feels this is the way to damage Ted Kennedy and destroy him. And in doing so, he brings private morality into the public sphere, where it's remained ever since, until one could say Donald Trump, who can do almost anything he wants to with impunity. But when you look at Kennedy or Bill Clinton or a host of other figures, they didn't do that with impunity. So it's important there. And it's also important because it enables Republicans to destroy and I look at a lot of this is self-inflicted. So, and Ted Kennedy would be the first to admit that. He does admit it in his famous speech after Palm Beach in 1991. But, it enables them to say, how can this guy, preach morality? How can this guy talk about what Americans ought to be doing in terms of embracing their better selves? Look at his life. Look at the kind of life he leads. He's a wastrel, apparently. Or obviously. So it was important because it gave Republicans, a handle with which to bludgeon the public morality that he that he was expressing and that he wanted the country to embrace. Now, I love the line of the columnist Richard Reeves, where he says of Ted Kennedy, he was a publicly moral man. I think Ted Kennedy himself would admit that. He was a publicly moral man. But I would also add this, in understanding the psychology of Ted Kennedy and how that psychology, intersects with the very thing you just asked, which is the general, political environment. Ted Kennedy was a very fallible man, and he knew it. And I believe this. I believe this after writing these books. I didn't believe it prior to. But after writing these books, I believe that fallibility is the basis of the greatness of leadership. Now, that sounds oxymoronic, and I'll just explain very briefly. What I mean by that is, when you're fallible and you realize your own fallibility, as Ted Kennedy did, it becomes a form of empathy. You understand other people's weaknesses. You understand the marginalized. You understand the poor. You understand the weak. You understand those things. And great leaders, whether it's Franklin Roosevelt, who had the fallibility of losing his ability to walk and then projected that onto the nation and understood the weakness of other Americans, or whether it's Ted Kennedy, who was always getting himself into trouble and understood that he was the least, and then connected that to the poorest and the most marginalized and the most vulnerable Americans. Whatever it is, empathy creates greatness. We just had a president who had no empathy, zero. Empathy creates greatness. And as I believe Ted Kennedy was a great public figure, he wasn't a great human being, but he was a great public figure. And I believe that he would not have been a great public figure had he not had that weakness that made him empathize.
Bill Clinton made a big thing of empathy. I mean, he made a big thing of putting himself in the shoes of those who needed help. He tried to triangulate that power, and he tried to kind of have it both ways and get along with conservatives in Congress,
right
but still maintain his liberal ideals. How did Ted Kennedy react to Bill Clinton's attempts at what was considered in the 90s as political pragmatism?
Kennedy himself was a pragmatist. And Kennedy never, you think of Ted Kennedy as being this sort of liberal firebrand ideologue who would never compromise. But Ted Kennedy always, I mean, his mantra was sort of, the old cliche, the perfect is the enemy of the good, or half a loaf is better than none at all. So he was a pragmatist himself. But here is where he and Bill Clinton parted ways. Kennedy was always fearful that Bill Clinton would compromise his principles, not just his policy. Compromising policy one could do. Kennedy did it all the time. The first thing he ever did when he started on a legislative campaign was say to his staff, find me a Republican. I need a Republican to pass this. I'm not here to grandstand. I'm not here to show how moral I can be without getting results. I have a chapter that's called Show Me the Results. I want the results. He feared that Bill Clinton was so pragmatic that he would give everything up. And throughout Clinton's presidency, Kennedy always wanted to be, he said, Bill Clinton listens to the last person who talks to him. So I always want to be the last person in that room who talks to him, because he'll give up anything to that last person.
People say that about Trump too, which is funny. I have two images. Really, it's one image of Ted Kennedy, but speaking at different times about two different things. And that is of a red-faced Ted Kennedy on the floor of the Senate, hammering away over two things. One was the Iraq War, and the other was the proposal to ban gay marriage in the U.S. Constitution. If it was in 2004, I was about 21 years old. And those are really the first times that I remember focusing on Ted Kennedy. I mean, I knew he existed, but when he came to the forefront of that debate, which was so heavily against those who were against the Iraq War, and the president of the United States is campaigning on this effort to ban gay marriage nationwide, and Ted Kennedy stood there on the floor of the Senate as sort of a craggly old guy and embraced the liberal positions. And I remember the redness in his face as he spoke out against both of these things. I guess the question just is, how did he get to a point where he could be the one to take all the heat and to be the one to say, these things are wrong, and I don't care what it does to my party politically or to me politically, I have beliefs?
That's a great question. And the answer, I think, is courage. There's very little courage in politics today. In fact, there's almost none. It's true. I mean, you look at politicians today and they want to get reelected. Well, Ted Kennedy did have, except for 1994 when he ran against Romney, the luxury of never really being challenged, in a competitive Senate race, except when he ran against Romney. But there are a lot of people in the Senate who don't run in competitive races. I mean,
almost all of them.
almost all of them now.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of
80% of them.
Yeah. But Ted Kennedy had courage. Ted Kennedy believed in those things, a publicly moral man. And I'll tell you, for all the talk, and I'm responsible for a lot of this in my books, of talking about the chemistry of the Senate and how he worked the Senate and how he got people on his side by being kind and good and writing thank you notes and making the first condolence call to a fellow senator, even a Republican, how he did all of those things. I'll tell you, Evan, why he was so effective a senator, first and foremost. And it wasn't just working the chemistry of the Senate in that way. It's something that Joe Biden said when he spoke at the dedication of the Edward Kennedy Institute. The most effective thing that Ted Kennedy had is the very thing you've just cited, and what Joe Biden cites. People didn't want to be small in front of him, even when they were small. Kennedy had moral passion, and everybody in the Senate knew it, even Republicans. He had a lot of friends among Republicans, until the latter days when the Republicans kind of, just changed completely and saw him as anathema. But he had moral courage and he had moral sincerity, and he believed in the things in which he was saying and the things in which he was saying. Okay, you raised two issues here. The Iraq War, which he turned out to be right on. I mean, it was a terrible miscalculation. And gay marriage, which we all know he was right on. He fought for compassion. He fought for tolerance, and he fought for decency. Isn't it odd? Isn't it odd that we had so many people fighting Ted Kennedy on compassion, decency, tolerance, all of those things? What the hell were they fighting for? Who were they fighting for? I mean, that's what I ask. I ask it in these books. We know who Ted Kennedy was fighting for. You know who he was fighting for. He was fighting for the powerless, the voiceless, the marginalized, the vulnerable, the weak, the kids. You know, perhaps his greatest legislative achievement.
The health care bill,
was the children's health insurance program that provided health insurance for children whose parents could not qualify for Medicaid but couldn't afford health insurance.
Yeah. What greater legacy could you leave behind and to get kids health care?
And yet, how many Republicans opposed that? George W. Bush didn't want to fund it. This is the kind of thing that, I always say when I talk about these books, Evan, that there are two protagonists in this book. One is Edward Kennedy. The other is morality. And I sound very old-fashioned in saying this, and I sound like an idiotic crusader. But you know something? No. I'll tell you what this idiotic crusader would tell your listeners and the American people. Morality is not out of fashion. Ted Kennedy spent 47 years in the Senate to fight the moral battle. And there are good and decent people in this country. And there are some not so good and decent people in this country, and in the Senate, and in the House. But we know the difference. We know the difference.
How do you draw a straight line from that courage to the decision to endorse Barack Obama over somebody who he knew extraordinarily well? And I'm sure publicly, at least, they call themselves friends. And certainly at this point, the Clintons and Kennedys go back, 30 years now.
And he and Hillary were allies.
Yeah.
He didn't trust Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
But he trusted Hillary.
Yeah.
Hillary was kind of his mole within the Clinton administration.
Right. So that decision to endorse Barack Obama, that was seen as a big moment in that campaign. How did he arrive at that decision, and how much waffling did he do before he said, I'm just going to do it?
There was a fair amount of waffling. The individual who impelled him to make that decision was Caroline Kennedy, his niece, who said to him a couple of things. She said to him, this man comes closest. And actually, she said this in the editorial she wrote in the New York Times when she endorsed him, just earlier that week before Ted endorsed him. This man reminds me more of my father than any political figure in my lifetime. And the second thing she said is, my children have heard him speak, and they are moved by him. They are deeply moved by him. And it was difficult because Ted Kennedy understood this. He understood that he was passing, that fallen standard that I mentioned earlier in the Worcester speech, the one that he picked up from his brothers. When he endorsed Barack Obama, he was giving that fallen standard to Barack Obama. He was saying to Barack Obama, you are now the inheritor of the Kennedy legacy. Barack Obama understood this. He said that himself. I understood when Kennedy endorsed me what that meant. And what that meant was I was now the legatee of the Kennedy legacy. But Ted endorsed him for the same reason that Caroline had given. That Ted believed this was not a normal politician. This was someone, earlier I talked about how Jimmy Carter kind of dampened the spirits of the American people. Barack Obama, in Ted Kennedy's eyes, was someone who could do what John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy did. He could lift the spirits of the American people. And that's why he endorsed it.
What would Ted Kennedy have said had he watched his old friend John McCain walk onto the Senate floor as a brain cancer patient and vote against the repeal of Obamacare? What would he have said if he could have witnessed that moment?
I think he would have said, this is the moral moment for John McCain. And he rose to the occasion, as I'm sure Ted would have thought he would have. He rose to the occasion to do the moral thing, rather than for political reasons, and there are purely political reasons, deny those 15% of Americans who could not afford health care, rather than deny them that for some political gesture. He did the moral thing. And it's interesting, Evan, it's interesting that you raised that. Because of all the things that John McCain did in his life, politically, I'm not talking about what he did during the Vietnam War, but of all the things he did in his life politically, that is arguably the single most significant thing he did, which was endorse a program by a Democratic president to aid those Americans who could not afford health care themselves. I mean, isn't it ironic that this Republican figure
and an opponent of Barack Obama, I mean, one of, the two people Obama faced in the presidency.
That's right, exactly. One of his opponents, and yet he makes the moral gesture. The moral gesture. And that's how Ted Kennedy would have seen it. It wasn't a political gesture. There were no politics in it. He gained nothing from it politically. It's the moral gesture. The moral gesture.
If our listeners want to hear about the funeral of Ted Kennedy, I would love to cover it in this episode, but we talked about it off the bat in the beginning of the first episode. So I'll link to that here if you're curious about the end of Ted Kennedy's life, which you and I discussed. But I want to ask about a little bit more in the future now, too. His old friend, Joe Biden. I guess Ted Kennedy had a lot of friends. He and Joe Biden served in the Senate.
He made a habit of having a lot of friends.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And he was around long enough to have I have a professor who would say he had the iron tushy and sat in the Senate for 50 years. How would he have appreciated and how would he have viewed Joe Biden's performance, his ascension to the presidency, and his performance in the presidency? And I guess there seems like some echo there because Biden had served in the Senate for so long and finally reached that last rung that he'd wanted for so long.
They were not similar personalities, in terms of their political convictions. I think Ted was always a little worried that Biden, like Clinton, would compromise. But when Biden came to the presidency, he did precisely the opposite. I mean, he saw himself as the heir of Franklin Roosevelt and pushed hard, not always successfully, but pushed hard to for the moral good of the nation. And I think Ted Kennedy would have been very impressed. In this day and age, Ted Kennedy had no illusions about political difficulties and political obstacles because he'd faced so many himself. The second volume is called Against the Wind for a good reason. He was sailing against the wind. And by the way, it was a gale wind. This wasn't just a light wind. It was a gale.
Enough to move that sailboat with him sitting in it, right?
Oh, yeah, that sailboat was moving backwards.
Yeah.
But I think he would have been deeply impressed by the fact that Joe Biden embraced the deeper morality of the nation, and that he encouraged it. And that at a time when many of us, myself included, I'm a pessimist by nature, look at the country and say, where did our virtue go? How did this happen that we elected a game show host as the president of the United States who's devoid of any moral decency whatsoever? How did that happen? Ted Kennedy would have said, in that environment, this man came and said, I'm going to call on the better angels of the American people at a time when a lot of people don't feel there are better angels. I'm going to call on them. And he did it. And I think Ted would have been proud of him, but that doesn't mean that Ted wouldn't be behind him, pushing him and pushing him and pushing him to do more and more and more, because that's what he did.
You defended earlier on in this episode why it's healthy to write a long book. Give us some strategies for reading a long book. How should people approach 2,000 pages of text? I love them. You don't have to convince me, but just give me some ideas here for people on to pick up a long book, and how do you read it in process, but also how do you read it and retain the things that you're reading over 2,000 pages?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, you can read 300 300-page books, and that's fine. Or you can read this big 1,000-page book, and it's basically there's the trade-off there is what? I mean, you're reading the same number of pages. But the second thing is, I said this book is long because the story is long, but it's more than that. When you write a book, you also have a sense of how the reader is going to read the book. I believe in a metaphysics of writing, that the reader detects how you write the book and what you're putting into it. And when you read a book of 1,000 pages, and I'm not saying you have to sit there night after night after night, slog your way through it. I don't think it's a slog, but the book becomes immersive. It becomes immersive for you as a writer, Evan, and I think it becomes immersive for you as a reader. I love long books. I love Caro's books. There's so many books what I think of in my life that I love because they're so immersive. By the time you're through with these books, you will be in the same position I was in when I wrote the books, which is you will have lived the life, not only of Ted Kennedy, but you will have lived the political life of the nation for 50 years. You will have gone through John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, all the way through the Bushes and even into the early part of the Obama administration. You will have lived all of that. You'll feel it. If I've done my job, you will feel it. And that's an experience. I want my books always to be experiences, not just a story or not just a bunch of pages, but an experience, so that when you close the book, and Ted Kennedy does die at the end of the book, so spoiler alert, but when you read those last lines, you will be in the situation that I was in when I wrote those last lines, which my eyes were teary. And I felt as I closed the book, literally and figuratively, I felt, my God, this is 12 years of my life these books took. But I've experienced 77 years of Ted Kennedy's life and 50 years of our political life. That's what I want you to feel. And if you feel that, then I've done my job. And it's worth reading.
They are damn. I mean,
I can make you feel that.
It's damn good. I mean, the books are fantastic and they're beautifully written. How much? You say 12 years of your life. Yes. The room around you looks relatively neat, although I can't see the floor. How much paper and stuff were you surrounded by as you tried to do this?
Evan, my desk is a mess, and you're seeing this point
right up to the okay.
My desk is. My wife comes in my office sometimes and says, "How do you ever get a book out of this?" So yeah, I'm surrounded by stuff all the time. I mean, there's piles and piles, and I think on the website of Crown Publishing on this book, they have a picture that I took of the 15,000 note cards that I piled up to write this book. So that you'll see this gigantic pile, of note cards everywhere.
And those are just things you wanted to remember to include. And are they organized by time period or by subject?
Well, I organize. Alfred Hitchcock used to say that by the time he starts filming the film, he'd already completed it because he had storyboarded every single scene of the movie. And I kind of work the same way. I write very quickly. I research very slowly. But I take all of this information and I put it all together in chronological order, or however I'm going to use it in the book. It's not always chronological. And basically, and I take Post-it notes and I put transitions on so that and I put the long bankers boxes. So I'll take out chapter 1 and chapter 2. And by the time I reach that process where I'm at the computer and I'm actually writing, basically the book is completely organized. Because as I said, there's the metaphysics to writing. And another thing I mean by that is that I want the writing to be very smooth. I want to be complete command of the material. I don't want to be herky-jerky when I'm writing. And I think the reader senses that. The reader says, oh, this is smooth. This is clean.
You use a computer as opposed to Caro with his cannibalized typewriter. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't use a typewriter. I use a computer. When I first started, I wrote longhand on my first book. But now I want, I look at the computer sort of as a piano.
Yeah.
And that's how I kind of think of this. I'm writing fairly quickly to get the flow and the rhythm. And, writing is so much a matter of rhythm. And so, I want to keep that going because I know it's going to keep the reader going. And the reader will pick up those rhythms. And the reader will get what I'm putting in.
Is there someone who lived their life in the reverse of Ted Kennedy, a conservative who went against the wind at first and then with the wind? Does that person exist?
I'm hard pressed to find someone because of the very thing I've said earlier. Conservatism, particularly modern conservatism, is not a moral enterprise. The primary things that conservatives are interested in are not things that are primarily moral. So it's hard to find, I think, a figure who fought the moral fight that Ted Kennedy fought. It's very difficult for me to find that kind of figure.
Is there any idea yet? And I'm not the one to be giving out homework assignments here. Do you have any idea as to who you'll do next if you'll do another book?
Well, I desperately want to do another book because, I live for two things. I live for my family and I live to write. And I love to write. And I love to share my ideas. I'm not sure my next book will be a biography. Right now, the book I'm thinking of is a history, but it isn't a biography. Or to put it differently, it's more of a biography of America in a certain sense than it is a biography of an individual. It'll be narratively driven, as my books always are. But I have a book in mind if I can sell it. And I will be perfectly honest with you and your audience. This is a very different environment than when I started this business many, many years ago. My first book was published in 1988. It's my own publisher, when I proposed my next book, and they love these books, at least they profess to love them. And the first thing they said to me was, well, you'll write it in 3 years. That's the condition. Well, I wrote these books in 12 years, so I don't write in 3 years. It's just not how I work. I used to say to my students, with somewhat conspiratorially, I can tell you how to write a book quickly. This is how you write a book quickly. Here's the secret. I don't follow it, but here's the secret. Write a crappy book. So I ain't writing a book in 3 years, I can tell you that.
Neal Gabler, the author of Against the Wind, Edward Kennedy and the Rise of Conservatism, 1976 to 2009. Thanks so much for being here once again.
Thank you very much for asking me.
Check out the book. Check out his others on Walt Disney and Barbara Streisand. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.